Hello, and today we're going to talk about the Wisdom of Solomon, an apocryphal book attributed to Solomon, but clearly it's got a much later date, so it's super. We believe the book comes from Egypt, perhaps Alexandria, from a Hellenized Jew who was very much a part of the conversation there. So he is the author, and we believe it's a single author, was very much a part of the Hellenistic community in Egypt and very much influenced by Greek philosophical categories. And so we see, even more than we've seen already, the mixture of Greek philosophy and Jewish philosophy, and but less so than we will see with Philo. So Wisdom of Solomon is a sort of from being completely Hebraic to Philo, who we'll talk about next, who is completely Hellenized in his thinking, even though he's still a devout Jew. Wisdom of Solomon sort of appears in the middle. So the date of the book really depends on how much you read into the comments about Egypt. So those who argue that there are some who argue that there's a sense of persecution going on, and for those they would place it around the persecution that took place in 38 CE, which would make it contemporary with Philo. But others argue for an earlier date, and probably more likely the late 1st century BCE, so that it does come before Philo. The language is Greek. We do not have any reason to believe that it was written in Hebrew first. It has Greek syntax, and then even when it quotes or makes reference to the Hebrew Bible, the book references it in its Septuagint form. So this is clearly generally. We understand this to be a Hellenized Jew who probably did not even speak or read Hebrew at this point, and for whom the Septuagint was his Bible. So to compare it in terms of genre and form, it is a book of wisdom, obviously, and it is associated with Solomon. But when you compare it to the other apocryphal book of wisdom, Sirach is much more Hebraic in its categories and its way of looking at the world, whereas in the Wisdom of Solomon, there's definitely a shift to explaining the world using Greek philosophical categories as opposed to and terminology as opposed to Jewish or Hebraic. But again, like Sirach, there is the sense, even when one talks about Judaism in Greek forms, there is always the belief that Judaism is the superior philosophy. This is how they would talk about it. I mean, clearly these are religious people, but the idea of, my pen is getting away from me today, superior philosophy. Sorry for the handwriting. So this is, like I said, and don't see that as secular, but rather philosophy in the ancient sense of this is how we understand the world, and that God's formed part of the Greek philosophy. Judaism, therefore, is the superior philosophy. And that is the goal. There is also the sense, not just of Jewish superiority, but to give intellectual respectability to the scripture and to intellectual respectability to the Hebrew understanding, and of course in that day that meant it had to be explained in Greek categories. There is also a sense that there is an attempt, like much wisdom literature, to give a sort of a theodicy to talk about why things aren't that great. And so it does talk more thoroughly than almost anything we've non-apocalyptic literature of this period of the immortality of the soul. And the a judgment and resurrection, not resurrection, excuse me, but a judgment, so that there, and this would be for the evil more than for the good, but the idea that those who have who do not lead wise lives will be judged as wanting in front of God and be punished for it. The book is also very important in Christian circles more than in Jewish circles, obviously, since it's the Apocrypha. But the Christians, particularly the early church fathers, were very much influenced by and used and quoted this book. So men like Tertullian or Origen, Irenaeus, the early church fathers. So in terms of form, it's generally divided into 3 parts, but exactly what it is, some people call it an exhortation, the idea of trying to, to exhort, to teach, to, the idea that, exhort or teach the superiority of Jewish reasoning. But there is also, there is a element of praise, in the sense of it is an ode to wisdom in many ways. So wisdom forms the central, and in this case, not just, wisdom as a category, but pretty much as a thing, separate from God. But before we get there, basically chapters 1 through partway through chapter 6 talks about the immortality of the soul and all of that immortality. So you can see why this would not, and we're not talking about resurrection here, we're talking about the immortality of the soul. Then the other half of 6 through 10 is the praise of divine wisdom. And in this case, because it is in the Greek, that is Sophia. And then 11 through the end of the book, 19, is a series of historical contrasts or comparisons between Egypt and the Jewish God. The idea particularly focuses on history of the Exodus, but again, all the and idolatry and all of the mistakes of the the Egyptian people in the face of the true God. So I want to talk about the issue of immortality. We don't find this in a lot of Jewish writing. So here we see the very, very clear influence of Greek tradition. So we do get the influence, we'll talk more about this with Philo, but the idea of the difference between the sensory world or the physical world and the spiritual world or the world of the mind. And this goes along then with a sense of a division between the body and the soul. So in much of Hebraic understanding anyway, there is an absolute unity between the body and the soul. But under the influence of Greek thought, we see forms of Judaism developing with this same sort of split. And the idea of the soul then being something that is immortal, the body then something that is temporary. So we do, and I'm going to just give you some verses. You've got the idea in 8:19 of the pre-existence of the soul. As a child, I was naturally gifted, and a good soul fell to my lot. This is supposedly Solomon talking about himself. So as a child I was naturally gifted, and a good soul fell to my lot. Or rather, being good, I entered an undefiled body. So it's not just the idea of immortality, but pre-existence. So the soul, in the wisdom of Solomon, is something that predate or comes before, pre-exists the body, and then from the body goes when the body goes back into its heavenly world. This is I'm going to talk a little bit about Plato when we get to understanding Philo, but his idea of the in 9:15, chapter 9:15, not, and I will read that. For the reasoning of mortals is worthless. I started in 14. For the reasoning of mortals is worthless, and our designs are likely to fail. For a perishable body weighs down the soul, and this earthly tent burdens the thoughtful mind. So again, this Plato is very much associated with this idea. So the idea then of a soul in Plato, it was the idea of the soul fell, so it was a negative thing, but not so much in the Jewish understanding. Even as Greek as this is, they are not going to downgrade the physical. At least with Wisdom of Solomon isn't. But there is a sense, again, of this pre-existence, the separation of the body and the soul that you find very definitely coming from Greek philosophical categories, and which is not yet, but some of you may be thinking towards the future, the development of Gnosticism. Gnosticism is also built off this, but we are nowhere near that yet in this era. So moving on, also the idea of the judgment of the soul is added onto this. So there is a strong sense that of judgment, and the soul, again, that is wise will join with God, and the one that is not, we're not quite sure, but there's a sense of judgment and perhaps the death of the soul in that case. In 3:10, I wanted to point out particularly starting in 3:10 through chapter 4, the end of chapter 4, there is the sense that the ungodly will be punished as their reasoning deserves, those who disregard the righteous and rebelled against the Lord. So this idea of judgment. But I also wanted to point out in verses like 14, verse 14 of this chapter, how very, very different the view of the body is, so that, and the relationship of the physical with the, in this case, moral. So blessed also is the eunuch whose hands have done no lawless deed, and who has not devised wicked things against the Lord. Well, a eunuch, given the Old Testament Torah attitude towards any imperfections of the body, would not have been allowed. So there's now physical perfection is less important than virtue. So again, and this is in chapter 4, verse 1, better than this is childlessness with virtue, for in the memory of virtue is immortality, because it is known both by God and by mortals. So this is going against a lot of basic Jewish concepts of eunuch would never have been allowed in the temple. The idea of being childless was the sense of losing your immortality. So there's again virtue, moral virtue, versus some of the more physical, and I don't hesitate with that word, but physical aspects of wisdom in the past that rejoiced in the physical relationships and saw the fulfillment in children and things like that. Our fulfillment now is moral and in virtue instead of, as its primary. By the way, in 4 verse 10, you see a reference to Enoch. There were some who pleased God and were loved by him, and while living among sinners were taken up. They were caught up so that evil might not change their understanding or guile deceive their souls. This is probably a reference to Enoch. The idea that the truly righteous can be, are actually maybe perhaps even removed for their own safety. So a very different view of immortality, or of what happens, instead of resurrection, which is where the main branch of Judaism went. Old Testament itself has no sense of life after death, but in groups like the Pharisees, we'll see, believed in resurrection. This idea of the immortality of the soul is something that is very much influential in the Greek context. But I wanted to talk about one more thing, and that is woman wisdom, or lady wisdom, because the thing about the wisdom of Solomon, and we go from Proverbs, where woman wisdom is definitely a personification. But with Sirach, we're not completely sure, but still we think it's a personification, just a much more elaborate one. But with Wisdom of Solomon, we get a full-blown understanding of woman wisdom and the hypostasis. That is something that the wisdom understood because of the feminine noun, the female, is somehow has a separate existence from God. This is going to play an important role in our understanding of Philo, who in turn, along with Wisdom of Solomon, the Writer of Wisdom in Solomon, was very influential on the our early church forebears. So the major speech about woman wisdom starts in 621. And here Solomon is speaking. He is, or at least that's the pseudonymous nature of this, Solomon is talking about wisdom. And so it starts, "Therefore, if you delight in thrones and scepters, O monarchs over the peoples, honor wisdom, so that you may reign forever. I will tell you what wisdom is and how she came to be, and I will hide no secrets from you, for I will trace her course from the beginning of creation, and make knowledge of her clear, and I will not pass by the truth, nor will I travel in the company of sickly envy, for envy does not associate with wisdom. The multitude of the wise is the salvation of the world, and a sensible king is the stability of any people. Therefore be instructed by my words, and you will profit. I also am mortal like everyone else, a descendant of the first formed child of earth." Talks about his own upbringing, and then, let's see, and so he asks for God to grant him wisdom, and he goes on. I think where I want to go now is 722b, actually, and this is a very much a sort of Greek way of talking about wisdom, but there is this sort of compilation of adjectives or activities, or the essence of what wisdom is. So there is in her a spirit that is intelligent, holy, unique, manifold, subtle, mobile, clear, unpolluted, distinct, invulnerable, loving the good, keen, irresistible, beneficent, humane, steadfast, sure, free from anxiety, all-powerful, overseeing all, and penetrating through all spirits. Now that, by the way, 21 different descriptors. And so, if you know the importance of the number 7, that is an intentional choice to go for 21. So it goes on, verse 24, for wisdom is more mobile than any motion. Because of her pureness, she pervades and penetrates all things. For she is a breath of the power of God and a pure emanation of the glory of the Almighty. Therefore nothing defiled gains entrance into her, for she is reflection of eternal light, a spotless mirror of the working of God, and an image of his goodness. Although she is but one, she can do all things, and while remaining in herself she renews all things. In every generation she passes into holy souls, and makes them friends of God and prophets. So the real key is the word emanation. This is why we know this is not a simple personification or even a complex personification. But the word emanation is the idea that something that comes from and yet has some form of a separate existence. So there's the belief that God, then the first of creation in a sense, was wisdom, who then dwells in some sense separate from God. Inhabits creation. There's a lot of the idea of wisdom and the basic form of creation. And it says, I loved, in verse 2, Solomon, this is 8:2, again with the personification, the pseudonymous nature, Solomon. I loved her and sought her from my youth. I desired to take her for my bride, and became enamored of her beauty. She glorifies her noble birth by living with God, and the Lord of all loves her, for she is an initiate in the knowledge of God. She is an initiate in the knowledge of God and an associate in his works. And I don't, that's a pretty amazing statement, that now we go from wisdom as a personification of a way of living, to wisdom being an emanation, part of the creation of God. Often can sometimes, one way to think about it is like wisdom is the firstborn of creation, and the idea that she is an initiate, or she knows wisdom knows the full mind of God, and so this is quite a statement. And we see a direct connection here, like I said, from Proverbs, Sirach, Wisdom of Solomon, Philo, and I think in many ways the New Testament understanding of the Logos, which this is Wisdom of Solomon, is a stepping stone on this development from this line from the idea of talking about wisdom as a person to her having some separate entity, to how the New Testament understands Jesus as and the Trinity. All of this idea is derives from this kind of thinking, and so we'll talk about Philo next, and he takes it the next step and associates wisdom with logos, and but that will be for another lecture. So again, the two major issues, Wisdom of Solomon being the view of life after death, immortality as opposed to resurrection, a very Platonic understanding of the separation of the physical, the sensory world, with the world of the mind, and then woman wisdom, who now is a complete, but has a separate existence from the divine. So she then is now, this is the term we use, hypostasis, separate, in approaching some ways the way that the New Testament understands Jesus and the Trinity. Not there yet, but pretty close.